the SIIA has had key sustainability programs, including the Singapore Dialogue on Sustainable World Resources. Since it was launched in 2014, it really tried to bring together high-level participants from government, the private sector, as well as experts and non-government organizations to really consider the best practices and discuss new commitments, noteworthy cross-sector collaborations that can make the resource sector more sustainable and more efficient. And in many ways, the heart of this has been about the haze, but then broadening out to what each of us can do. This year, because of the pandemic, we'll be holding the SWR in a virtual format in early November, as Sarah said. I mentioned the haze, and that's been a perpetual returning problem for the region. And one of the SWI's efforts here has just been launched for its second time. This is the SWI Haze Outlook. This tries to provide a risk assessment about the probability of a severe transboundary haze incident. And we look at factors such as the weather and the conditions involving the peat and forests, but also people. And by people, we mean what the governments do and what the corporates and NGOs do. And this year's Haze Outlook included a new section looking particularly at the environmental, social, and governance practices of major companies in the sector, the ESG, that's the title of today's webinar. We really believe that ESG is a factor that influences how companies manage their assets and, in this sense, contribute or help prevent the haze and improve sustainability practices across their business. Now, having said the general background, let me introduce Gan Mei Shi. Mei Shi is our assistant director who's leading on sustainability program and specifically the ESG report. Mei Shi, would you just share, before we start, something more about the ESG report as a context for what the two speakers will be talking about?
Sure, thank you, Prof. Tay. So as Prof. Tay mentioned, this year in the Haze Outlook, we actually had a new section that started to delve into the ESG practices of companies in this sector. And we have expanded that research now into a full report on company ESG practices. And this report is going to be released at the SDSWR virtual conference in November. So what the report does is to examine the ESG practices in the agribusiness and resource sector. And the goal of the report is really to align stakeholders on current best practices and challenges in ESG in this specific sector, and to provide some recommendations to help stakeholders shape common standards and expectations for sustainable production, as well as to measure sustainability going forward. So this webinar is very timely because today we will look at how companies in the agribusiness and forestry sectors have responded to increased scrutiny on ESG in varying ways. And so at this point, I would like to introduce our two esteemed speakers, Mr. Corrado Forcellati, Director of Sustainability Services at KPMG Singapore, and Ms. Perpetua George, General Manager, Group Sustainability at Wilmar International. So Corrado will be our first speaker for today. Corrado has extensive experience in wholesale banking before joining KPMG, so he will be able to provide very interesting perspectives on ESG for us. Corrado, please.
Thank you, Mei Shi, and Prof. Simon and the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for extending the invitation to speak. I'm actually very honored as well to do it together with PEP and share this journey of insights and view. And let me start bringing a little bit of context. When I saw the title of the webinar, there were three words that actually caught my attention. So the word embracing and rising, and then finally the uncertain world. And especially the uncertain world brought me to think about the VUCA. And I think many of us, we have been facing and Prof. Simon, just again an acronym, to the exposure that we have had and we still have business-wise in terms of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And then, since we are looking at it from the side of the COVID, I was actually thinking, what if today we are looking into what does it really mean to live in a COVID world from an ESG perspective? And here is my take. So C stands for climate change. I think in the COVID world, never before I have noticed that climate change is entering the households. So it's kind of being broadcasted in TV and you can read about it much more frequently than before. So the sense I'm getting is that both in terms of acute and chronic risk, there is a better understanding from the corporates, especially here in Asia, that either you are part of the solution or you probably are part of the problem. So there is a lot of interesting conversation happening around the climate change, and I'm sure we will be able to debate in the going as well more about this. So C for climate change. The O in COVID, to me, from an ESG perspective, stands for overwhelming. I think if you are a corporate in Asia and you're looking at the amount of requirements, the number of frameworks, standard, principles, commitments, opinions given by consultants like myself, banks, regulators, you name it. I mean, I appreciate that you can get confused. So in a way, if I should give an analogy, if ESG is a destination, which is not, I mean, ESG is a journey to me, but let's just play with the thought that this is a destination. And you have heard about this destination as being the heaven. You have to reach the destination of ESG. You don't know how to get there. And you start relying on frameworks, commitments, again, work advices. I can see that if you are driving a car and you need to get to that destination, it might not be that easy because there are so many roads and paths and different opinions in how to reach it. So that's the O for overwhelming. So I appreciate that when I'm looking at the corporate sector in Asia, I appreciate the confusion that all the overwhelming around ESG is causing. The V to me stands for virtual. And from an ESG perspective, is not only working from home that is creating a new type of reality. I think the whole, when I'm looking at the forestry in particular, and we are doing some work in Indonesia and Malaysia as we speak, you have a new set of virtual reality that is generated by data and data points and data sets that you haven't really been assessing before. The interesting part from, if you want, from a corporate sector perspective is how do you go about it? How do you, is that virtual reality, is it reality when you go to the ground? And actually you can't really go to the ground right now to verify it. So it's an interesting aspect that I'm also happy to share some views later on. The I for COVID, to me, stands for implementation. I think there are many activities that we start seeing from a variety of corporates in different sectors. And implementation is also happening in different speeds and with different maturity levels and with different type of engagement. And the implementation is driven, good and bad, increasingly by regulatory expectations. So this is also something that I feel the corporate sector in Asia is rising to the sustainability challenge, maybe not necessarily from the aspect of implementing it from a business model angle, but rather because it is expected. So more from the compliance side. And here I will just leave an open question to everyone to think about. If I'm putting myself as a corporate, am I playing to win the ESG game, or am I playing not to lose it? And I think there is a big difference if you play to win or you play not to lose. And I think there is a lot of work that can be actually done and a lot of views that can be shared in terms of how do we play to win, and are Asian corporates playing to win. The D for COVID in an ESG perspective, to me, stands for digital. Also here, COVID has definitely accelerated the digital transformation. We are seeing, as never before, companies, especially in this part of the world, introducing dashboards, enhancing monitoring routines, building new processes on machine learning and artificial intelligence. So you have a lot more tools that are being deployed around the ESG to create the transparency that the market is fundamentally expecting from a corporate. So if I should summarize, I think in addition to this VUCA world that everyone has been appreciating and in a way understanding and taking into the business models of living with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, in addition to that, now we have a COVID world. And if you are looking at it from the ESG perspective and you're looking at both worlds, it actually looks like a number of opportunities that you can tap into in order to create engagements, right? So to conclude my speech, this, to me, ESG and embracing ESG is really about being able and capable of speaking a language that is emerging. And that language is emerging fast in ASEAN, and it's definitely emerging faster in this uncertain world that is driven by COVID. So climate change, overwhelming, virtual, implementation, and digital.
Thank you very much, Corrado. Before I let you, before we move on to Perpetua, could I just ask you quickly, the speed of the overwhelming, sort of the overwhelming demands on them. Do you find that in this period, companies are picking up their efforts to move to ESG, or, ESG business is slowing down in a sense?
I think they are, but I also feel the tension and the trade-off that many corporates are facing. So in that open question I had, if you play to win or you play not to lose, probably the answer depends on your availability of resources, because you might have the right intention, so that's why you are playing not to lose, right? But whether you are really able to play to win, it really depends on your resources. And I appreciate that COVID is also creating some short-term focus that you can't just disregard. You can't say I'm not attending it because I have something else that I need to do that is fit for the future.
Thank you very much. Resources both in terms of the funding and profits, but also in terms of time and management attention.
Absolutely.
Thank you. The second panelist is Perpetua George or Wilmar, and I think it's very broad context that Corrado has set can be in a way answered by Perpetua and Wilmar, who've been looking at ESG for many years before coming to this crisis. Obviously, feel the crisis, feel the change, the COVID world, as Corrado put it. Perpetua, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and appreciate as well, I think, the sort of context that was provided earlier, especially by Corrado. Thanks, Michelle, for sort of putting up the slides. I mean, I don't want to bore everybody in this panel with slides. I've only got 3 slides, and that's really to illustrate perhaps, I think, some of the points to be made as part of this discussion. But just picking up a little bit from what Corrado had talked about in regards to what the COVID pandemic has brought to businesses, particularly in this part of the world. And I think speaking on behalf of the agriculture sector, in particular from the palm sector, I think, in fact, the palm sector has been perhaps better prepared than the other sectors in regards to dealing with the challenges that COVID has brought brought in, particularly in regards to ESG. And I say this because of, I think the fact that the palm sector, has for very many years, even now, is considered a controversial sector, and therefore the historical demands on ESG reporting and sustainability implementation within the palm sector has been very, very high from the early 2000s. And I think that has prepared, many of the, particularly I think the larger palm companies with regards to, what the sort of COVID-19 has created, the sort of cracks around, potential issues with, environment, potential issues with sort of workers and labor, and also climate change. I think it has, in a way, I suppose the palm sector has been ready, I think, for the challenges that COVID has brought up to that degree, at least in regards to if you're looking at what ESG reporting expectations are. But what I will say is perhaps the ESG reporting frameworks are not ready for COVID-19. And that I think, and especially now, we've started to receive additional questionnaires from the various listings and the various sort of benchmarks to sort of, ask very specific questions around how COVID-19 is being handled. And I think it's very clear to us looking at these that what the sort of benchmarks and sort of frameworks are trying to do now is try to encapsulate, well, what does this mean in terms of overall reporting, right? And I suppose in a way, what this slide is trying to articulate as well is sort of the where ESG reporting has come to. And we know now, for example, if we're talking about Asia, the listed companies under SGX, 2017 was when sustainability reporting became fundamental. Malaysia, that was actually a little bit earlier, 2006 originally for requirements of reporting CSR activities within annual reports, but then 2016, that became more of a requirement to report sustainability. And now for the Jakarta Stock Exchange, that's going to be a requirement now for all publicly listed companies as of 2020. But really, if you look at what ESG reporting is requiring is really, these elements that started off from looking at it from very environmental footprint specific element, building in that sort of social, later on governance, and then now, a lot of it much more focused on the climate change parts of it, but very much, whether they call it ESG, environmental social governance, or whether they call it EEC, economic, environmental, community, or social EES, basically it means the same thing. So, this what I think Corrado had referred to, there's a lot of kind of confusion about what it is. The acronyms don't help, I must say. It's sort of like a alphabet soup of that. But really what this focuses on is really the expectation that companies would be reporting really on their own operations, and very much looking at it from, are you taking into consideration potential risks to your businesses around, the environmental social governance elements of it. And that, I think, it really differs, right? I mean, if you look at it from the context that ESG reporting frameworks favor industries that are not controversial, favors industries that are perhaps a little bit further away from, upstream challenges. What you then have is a sort of situation where perhaps what's coming out in terms of ESG reporting may not reflect maybe most accurately what's sort of going on in sort of the implementation space, right? So we're looking at, again, if we talk about what COVID-19 has done, it's created, I think, more awareness on, let's take, for example, in the construction sector, sort of issues around how labor is being taken care of, what are the sort of social requirements and expectation around how you take care of your workforce, health and safety concerns. And if you look at the various sustainability reports that have come up for the construction sector in Singapore over the last couple of years, they don't touch about this. They don't talk about the sort of labor workforce management, because it's not seen as a, as a risk perhaps. But what that's highlighting now is basically you need to address this. But if you look at this from context of, again, the lens of a palm company, we've had to look at issues regarding sustainability since the early 2000s. And so coming up with the challenges what COVID has thrown to us, I think we are handling this, and not necessarily to say that the palm sector is handling it the best comparatively, but the point is it is something that is being handled. And that something is, I think, what COVID-19 is showing is perhaps that the using ESG reporting as the only basis for how you're looking at overall performance of implementation maybe isn't the best way to do it. And I think, again, if we go on to the next slide, Michelle, I think what is important to articulate here is if you look at just maybe Wilmar's sustainability journey from 2008, when you start looking at the palm sector really starting to come on board sustainability certification. And we published our first sustainability report in 2009. And, I was just this morning just looking at that report versus the one that we just published this year. And the difference is quite huge in that 2009, we were really only focusing on what was going on within our own operations, really looking at what I would say maybe basic issues that were first coming out around that time. But we look at now the 2019 report that was just issued under Wilmar, and you can see there the difference is that for at least for the palm sector, at least for Wilmar, there is an expectation now to focus also on the performance, the ESG performance of our suppliers, right? And that's something that if you look at this trajectory here and this roadmap, something that for Wilmar began in 2013 already. So we've had kind of 7 years of that expectation from external stakeholders to really push through whatever we want to call it, sustainability or ESG requirements from the wider supply chain and not just on our own operations. So that's we've had 7 years of that. And so because of that, I think if you look at what's happening on the ground now in terms of implementation, one, I think could bring, I suppose, a sort of come to a conclusion that I think when we're looking at overall performance and whether things are going to be affected by COVID-19 or not is really perhaps maybe to look beyond just asking companies to fill in the box and say, what are you doing with COVID? What's any new policies around COVID? Because perhaps that's not going to be enough, right? And I think, at least for us, the way that we've tried to respond to that is to sort of say, well, we don't have, apart from the additional COVID-19 standard operating procedures that we need to have in place where our operations are, all the elements around how we treat labor, how we look at deforestation issues, how we look at hiring, and the workforce stuff, that remains the same across the board. So we've not had to change it just because of COVID. And I think, when I look at these things that we've had to respond in the last few months, I'm not sure the analysts that are looking at that data will necessarily understand why it's not a bad thing that you don't have a specific COVID policy, because your social responsibility policy or how you're treating your workers policy is the same no matter what, regardless of whether it's COVID or not. So I think these are some of the challenges that I think we're posing is when it's, I think, perhaps not enough just to look at reporting, but also to be looking at the implementation. But where does this mean? Where is Wilmar going with this? I think if we go to the last slide, Michelle, thank you, is really, I think, to understand that the expectations now around ESG reporting are huge. And I think Corrado also referred to this, Professor Simon, they said the same thing, in that it's not enough anymore to be just putting in, a few CSR details in your annual report. It's not enough. You have to be reporting this. And the challenge here is how do you, at least for Wilmar, right? Our challenge here is how do we take the actual implementation that we have and try to translate that into more of reporting language that the ESG guys want to see, right? And I think that for us is always the biggest challenge is, we're heavy on the implementation, but how do you then translate that into reporting? And I think for us as well is looking at the expansion of scope of our disclosures. And I think to really illustrate this for us is the next big step, because from 2019, when we had our first sustainability report, the focus was very much on what civil society organizations, NGOs, and what external sort of were talking about in terms of what expectations and materiality were. So really, I think the concerns, and still today we get this, like the concerns from external stakeholders on Wilmar is very much about our plantation operations, but actually Wilmar is much bigger than that, right? And so when we start now looking at what ESG reporting is now requiring us to do, it's requiring much more of a breadth of that reporting to cover much more of the business. And this is where we're moving from 2020 onwards, is to really start to not just be sort of really deep within the upstream side on the disclosures, but also start to broaden what we're reporting across the board for Wilmar as a business, but also wanting to maintain, I think, the depth of that detail of how we're describing you know, our ESG reporting for what is still seen as most material externally. So I'll just sort of leave that as a sort of the last point from Wilmar. But again, I think just to sort of wrap it up, I think for us, we see within the COVID world that there is a clear differentiation between what I think is seen as the reporting of what you're doing, but also what is the implementation. And that perhaps is the challenge. So yeah, that will be it. So I'll just sort of pause now, and perhaps we can get into a really interesting discussion on how we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Perpetua, for sharing part of the journey Wilmar has been taking to really not just, maybe Corrado put it well, not to lose, but in a way to win. Not just to deal with the focus of many external stakeholders on plantations, but even to look more internally, both deeply, but also broader at more of the downstream activities and impacts for business. And also, I'm grateful for you to, you know, sort of share with us how you saw the evolution of the ESG focus, much more beyond your own business into the more supply chain angle as well. We're open for questions and answers. And of course, we'd like to take advantage of the fact that we've got many people on this call to tap them. I think Seraphim has told you how to do that. There's a question and answer function, and I'll try my best to look at it as we go along. But I would also like to start us off by just sort of reacting to some of the initial points that the two panelists have made. One word that sometimes crops up, which I haven't really heard that much from the two of you today, is the question of incentives. You know, I mean, maybe at the closest we got to that, again, was Corrado's idea that it's more regulatory pressure, or when Perpetua talked about the expectations, the huge expectations of the different stakeholders and investors. But what about this word incentives? I mean, what drives it on a positive side, so to speak? Is it necessary? And what could it be?
Yeah, I can give it a shot to start with. To me, incentives are important in order to create because I'm back to my point about resources. So incentive to me can be a resource that you are injecting into a process. And that process must have a clear path and some clear goals in why are you actually injecting an incentive, because you want something to move. So if you're thinking it from a closed loop, and you're thinking about the incentive really being an injection of funding, capital, liquidity to trigger a process that otherwise will be stuck, because everyone will look at each other and saying who should be the one that actually comes with the money first and who's paying for it, then I think that incentives have a very positive impact. But again, what is important in order for an incentive to have an impact, you really need to kind of see it through end to end, so that the incentive is actually fulfilling the purpose that it's meant to.
Corrado, I'll come to Perpetua in a while, but since you're a consultant, you probably deal with many more sectors than just palm oil. Do you see incentives having a role in some of the other sectors? Would, for example, one of the things that is emerging is the idea of carbon credits. It may work in some sectors, but not necessarily all sectors.
Yeah, certainly. We see that happening in many different sectors. But again, if you are referring to carbon credits to, you can take transportation, airlines as an example. They are building now, COVID aside, they are building their own marketplace, because what they are realizing as well, that the marketplaces are not connected, which is a challenge. So yes, you might have an incentive by having your carbon credits, but equally so, you need to make sure that you have the proper infrastructure and marketplaces to be able to actually put a value to those credits. So the credit itself is only halfway of the equation. Yeah, and that's back to my point. We need to be able to close the loop so that the incentive, whether it is a credit or a grant or a subsidy or whatever incentive form we might have, do fulfill a purpose.
Thank you, Corrado. Perpetua, would you like to talk about incentives a bit, if any?
Yeah, and I think this is sort of, I guess, the message that at least Wilmar, but also the pump sector has been saying for a while now, that it's really, if we talk about sustainability in general, I mean, it's far and away, it's no longer a trend. We can't call it a trend anymore because it's now an expectation. And so, you know, for want of a better way to phrase it, I think it is sustainability, at least with pump sector, is becoming the new business as usual. I mean, it's an expectation. If you don't have it, you will lose your, you know, reputational value, market value. You won't be relevant within the marketplace. And I think that is, at least for, you know, the larger companies, what is kind of pushing that, you know, the stronger ESG reporting, stronger implementation, stronger engagement across the board for all these issues. But I think perhaps what is maybe more needed is, I think, less about the larger corporates, but more around, you know, how do you deal with improvements of ESG for the smaller companies that are they're not publicly listed. There's no real requirement for them to sort of report. So, and I think this is where, you know, the pressures that are coming, or the requirements that are coming for financial institutions become much stronger, because, you know, if you know, in order to access capital, smaller companies will be, you know, required to talk about, you know, how they are implementing ESG or reporting about that, then that something suddenly becomes, you know, a little bit more relevant to, you know, at least if you look at agriculture sector, to a wider chunk of companies. And so I think I definitely see the financial and capital markets, I think, needing to sort of move within that, and, you know, help the sort of, you know, MAS in June 2020 started a consultation on the environmental guidelines. So I think that's really good. You know, the Malaysian Security Commissions started this, I think, for 2019, issuing their, you know, social responsible requirements. So I think it's moving in the right direction. I think and we're seeing also a lot of questions, at least from our stakeholders, like from banks and investors, asking us sometimes a little bit, well, how should we be looking at some of these elements? And so I think there is definitely, I think, an ability to leverage on, you know, I guess, who's holding the money in regards to some of the expectation around ESG to drive, I guess, the sort of, you know, the smaller companies, the medium to smaller size companies, to also start reporting, but also enhancing their own performance on sustainability.
Thanks, Perpetua. I think the point made about the expectation is very real. For example, HGV from Malaysia just got hit by sanctions from the USA. That's been quite recent news, I think. Though, of course, you in the industry would have heard much more. But I think the point you also make about the incentives for the smaller companies is very important. You know, the SIIA is proud to say that about 3+ years ago, we led the report on green finance in Singapore, and really could see the need to move investors, etc., and create a marketplace. But that was really an answer at the best as emerging for the large companies and, you know, with the investables. Your point about the smaller companies that don't have listings, that don't have necessarily a lot of investors, broad-based investors, is a very real one. Can I be clear though, I'm not industry expert. So when you say smaller company, we're not talking about really the small holders, right? You're talking about the national scale companies, etc.
Yeah, sort of, you know, your 1-2 mil companies, you know, that level rather than smallholders.
Yeah. And in a way, I guess your hope is that as the green finance or sustainable finance thing deepens, then more instruments can be found to sort of push it down into those level of companies. Is that correct? But
that's right.
Please.
That's right. Yeah. And just to sort of maybe finish that point is that Wilmar has had, I think, for 3 years now, something we call the sort of supplier reporting tool. Mm-hmm. Now that is a platform that we provided to all our suppliers in order for them to basically report how they're doing on key indicators. So that includes deforestation, development on peat, and sort of social exploitation elements to that. One of the things that we have said to our smaller suppliers is, look, you can use that. That report is for you. You can, yes, you're reporting it to us as your buyer, but the idea is also for you to be using that report if should you need it for banks or any other entities. And I think when we had that initial conversation 3 years ago, it was a harder sell. But I think as of this year, we've actually had our numbers go up in terms of the guys using that tool, because I think there is a recognition that it is actually useful to have that kind of resource. So I think we are seeing it move. And again, I haven't crunched the numbers on this, but colloquially, that's what we're getting from the responses of our suppliers so far.
That's very good to know. And not just to advertise Wilmar, but it's a very important step in the overall understanding. Because on the other hand, when banks or financial institutions say they want to help the middle and the smaller holders, how do they measure? So if they are reporting to you as suppliers already and you stand by those reports, then it does give some degree of assurance and verification. Corrado, what do you think of initiatives like that by the big companies?
Yeah, one comment to Perpetua's point just now, and yours as well around verification and assurance. If you recall the V as virtual in my COVID world, this virtual reality is actually leading to something very interesting right now, almost like a new practice. And I probably will call it virtual assurance, also due to the fact that you can't be on the ground, on site, actually verifying and assuring that the data that goes into a report are actually accurate. And it creates as well a different type of tension that I start seeing within the corporate sector. Are you targeting accuracy or are you targeting completeness when you are reporting? So to Perpetua's point, I really I'm encouraged about having platforms that are made available to smaller companies, small holders, that they can actually take the benefit. Increasingly, however, I also start seeing that there is a need, increasingly, from the market again, that third parties will have to verify and assure that the data and the reports that are produced are actually, in line with the reality. So virtual reality and this virtual assurance, I think, is a new scope of work that I'm also sure that KPMG will be involved in the very near future.
So could join the debate in the sense that what you're saying, Corrado, I take it to mean that you think the market at the moment would demand an additional step beyond what Perpetua and Wilmar are doing.
Yes.
To really feel the comfort level. Now, Perpetua,
Yes.
I would bring it back in. Earlier on in your conversation, you mentioned this difficulty of taking implementation of the actual things on the ground and somehow finding a way to report them. Would you tell us a bit more about that, and especially not just for Wilmar, but in terms of the smaller suppliers you deal with?
I mean, I think it's a relevant point, and just to be clear, I think the platform that we introduce also includes a verification step, so that's sort of encompassed within that. Just to clear, but again, not just talking about Wilmar. I think when we look at the expectation for verification, at least like an independent verification, that has always been there for the palm sector. So I think for the palm sector, it's not so much the kind of, that there is no shock in the request for this, for the need to have verification. It's more around, I think the conversations that are happening in the palm sector is more around the balance. How do you strike a balance between, having to have like a team of 10 on the ground 3 days per mill to it being more balanced? And I think with COVID, it's become even more of a big issue is how do you balance that? I think, if you look at the certification schemes, the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, they've put in place since, I would say maybe April this year, a requirement that audits maximum only 70%, I think can take place virtually. There are still some elements of the criteria that with the 30% that does require kind of field verification. And so, I think there are some elements to try and balance out the need to be on the ground to verify certain things versus what can be virtually done, right? So maybe documentation, etc. So I think there are moves there. And I think even for us, in Wilmar, what we've started working with NGO partners to look at, okay, well, if we're looking at a kind of virtual verification, what could that entail? And we've trialed out a couple of elements of this to see what works. And so far, I think it has been generally all right. But again, I think there are certain elements that you do need to have some feet on the ground. How this relates back to the question about the implementation versus reporting, I think it's precisely that, right? Like, I think right now, if you're looking at, for example, what DJSI, MSCI, even TCFD, what they're asking for basically reporting. So what is the sort of public statements, everything? They're not checking implementation. And so I think one of the things that frustrates us participating in these kinds of indices is the fact that we know we're doing, but because it's not written in that exact way that they want publicly, then it doesn't count, right? So that's what I meant really by the challenge of how you translate something that is being implemented to what a kind of reporting analyst is looking for. And I think if we're looking at it again with the COVID lens on, you're looking at it again in the same way. Is my example earlier about saying, you know, our social and labor policies apply with or without COVID. But if you give that answer to an analyst who is specifically asking, do you have a COVID-19 policy on labor? The answer, they will just say that, well, that's no, right? So then that doesn't count. So there is this disjoint. So it is an interesting conversation. And I think the various lenses only intensify the fact that there maybe isn't necessarily a straight line between whether, if good reporting, does that equal good implementation?
You mentioned a number of the reporting standards, etc. I've got a question from Cheryl Chen. I think this is the Cheryl Chen who is with one of the ratings agencies. It's quite a detailed question. I think the two panelists can read it, but I wonder whether Cheryl would like to voice it and whether we can get a virtual mic to her. Is that possible? SWI Events, Michelle?
Yes, give me a minute.
Cheryl, would you like to ask a question yourself? I'm not sure I understand it well enough. I'm a mere law professor, you know.
She has the mic.
Cheryl, would you go ahead?
Hi, Simon. Hi, panelists. Thank you so much for the insightful sharing. The question I have is really, you know, data quality and broad adoption of ESG reporting according to our standardized reporting standards for comparable data is really key to the next level growth of ESG. At the current phase, you know, we all know that data quality is non-ideal and there is a rather sharp proliferation of reporting standards and different ways of reporting on ESG with different focus and different lens and emphasis. How do we get to where financial reporting and accounting standards is?
And Cheryl did mention this, neither did I. She's from S&P. So would either of you like to respond to this very difficult question?
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Cheryl. Corrado, would you like to give it a stab?
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. My take, certainly depending on what we are measuring, the data points available are not necessarily comparable. And the reason for that gap is also due to the fact that we do not have a standardized or a baseline as we have for financial accounting. So some of the solution is probably at source. I think it will be very interesting to see whether the work that the AU is doing around the taxonomies and thereby creating a better classification, whether that will actually help harmonizing the data. But I'm also appreciative and a little bit to Perpetua's point. I think we will be seeing in this period an uncertainty and a volatility in the ratings and the scores because the data set is not necessarily comparable. And I think we need to be careful that we are not building up a complexity on the complexity, so that we are having a human complexity that we are all of a sudden building around the data governance by introducing even more standard baselines. So back to my initial point on this overwhelming, if Standard & Poor is providing a GPS to Wilmar, and Wilmar is following that GPS needs to have an accuracy in order for Wilmar to be able to use it as a reliable navigation system to reach to a destination, right? But if the GPSs keep changing, I can understand that Wilmar as a driver can, again, be very confused. And I think there is, and a little bit is, this is a very personal opinion, I think there is a risk for corporates in Asia, and that's a little bit back to my point, are you playing to win or are you playing not to lose? If you're playing not to lose, you will follow what others will tell you to do. So you will look at the ratings, you will look at the scores, you will kind of trick the system because you know that if you do this and this and this, you will be good.
Mm-hmm.
But you're playing not to lose.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Corrado. Perpetua, you've in a way answered the question before it was asked because you're talking about the difficulties, etc. Would you like to add anything in particular? If I could ask one thing to add to that, speak a little bit about your journey. I mean, Wilmar's journey. I mean, you really, as you said, you've been in it for some time. And I would say that really, you're not playing to lose. Sorry, you're not playing not to lose. I mean, you're playing to win.
Yeah,
So
definitely playing not to lose. Definitely we don't want to lose. That's the point, yeah.
To actually implement and further the standards.
Yes.
How does that transformation happen?
Yeah, and I think maybe in a way to respond also to Cheryl's question, right, is I think there's a difference in, I guess, companies and industries that started out with implementation versus those that started out with reporting. Because then what you see here is, again, you look at the palm sector, and I guess to a certain degree, the petroleum sector, they've started from having to much more heavy lifting on the implementation, and therefore the sort of knowledge base on what needs to be done, it has built up, and it's clearer really in terms of, okay, what's material, what do you actually need to do in order to get to that point. But therefore, with that kind of start, and again with Wilmar, what you then sort of see is potentially that doesn't link up with the sort of, the sort of what people expect on the reporting side of things, right? But if you then were on the reverse, where you're a company that you've started your journey because you've had to meet ESG requirements, you're really going to be looking at it more from and I don't mean to be rude, but like a tick boxing exercise. Okay, I got this policy, this, tick, tick, tick. How do I win? How do I sort of move to improve better? It's a lot less clear because you're really looking at, okay, what am I required to report? So, I think that is quite telling. And for Wilmar, it's also the way that we started was on the sort of heavy need to implement first. And so, again, anyone who's got lots of time, look, we're all COVID housebound now, right? If you just look at the 2009 Wilmar SR Sustainability Report and the 2019, you can kind of see the journey that we kind of went through. But again, all of that was very much based on the fact that Wilmar set our KPIs based on what the implementation needs were rather than the reporting needs. And we're now at a position, I guess in our age, our sustainability maturity, where we kind of have to balance that out a little bit in terms of, okay, how do we then translate perhaps these KPIs to sort of more meet the kind of reporting framework? But, and I guess in a way, we were talking about comparability and sort of maybe things being a little bit more aligned. We had hoped, we were really happy that GRI and SASB were sort of talking in the same room this year, but and then they said we're gonna cooperate, but we were like, no, we were sort of hoping that they would at least, kind of align, maybe come together. But okay, barring that they're at least in the same room now, and at least, we feel there's potential for sort of at least some corroboration, I think, around those requirements. So, I think we will never get to a point where it will be sort of full agreement, but I think the key thing here is when ratings agencies, I think what we would really suggest is really to look at perhaps the industry much more closely and the sustainability journeys that those industries have made to perhaps make that alignment with the reporting a little bit easier.
Yeah, I know you mean. Some companies, like my friend Ho Kwon Ping from Banyan Tree, really started with a lot of commitments of a heartfelt motivation, and their reporting, frankly, I've been told that reporting is for them is sort of so-so, because they can't figure out how to translate that into things that are sort of standardized and reportable. And you made a second point about how the present expectations among climate change with GRI, etc., are again shifting some of the ESG reporting. Now, I'm not in the thick of things as you are. Would you like to spell out to some of the audience what kind of shifts are we seeing for companies with strong ESG? What would the climate angle add to it? How is it sort of different or challenging?
Well, so here's the thing, like for companies that are more upstream, it's the sort of requirements of what the sort of climate change reporting is asking for, it almost doesn't gel. Like they're asking for, you know, are you projecting forward? What are your kind of strategies to remain business relevant in climate change? And for us, we look back, we sort of say, well, you know, the plantation sector has been monitoring like climate weather patterns for like, you know, since the 1900s, 1800s, in fact. And it's always been something that was there, and the strategies have moved over the last 100 years, right? So that's the climate change strategy. But now they're sort of asking for, well, how do you project that forward? It sort of, it almost doesn't translate well, because it's written from a very downstream consumer facing angle, right? So in a way, hence sort of what we're saying now is, you know, you need to start to translate that, is what is it that the reporting is aiming to achieve, without it looking like a plaster or a sticker just to meet requirements.
Either my technology is not working, I'm an old dinosaur, or I can't get any questions on this machine. So I've got one more question, then perhaps we can round up by allowing you to speak to any point that somehow in my ineptness I've forgotten to ask you. One of the other things that's nice about Perpetua George's graph earlier, it reminds us that in a way ESG has been a journey where green has been on it for a long time. I'm pro-green. But similarly, I think a lot of us are concerned about social aspects. And that to me seemed newer, as your chart showed. But it's happening. As I mentioned, the FGV problem with America, it's about labor. And similarly, last year I was involved in a sort of world sort of commission on against modern slavery. More broadly, Corrado, and then more specifically in the palm sector, Perpetua, how do you see that S part, especially about labor, moving, especially with the populism and the pressures on jobs, et cetera, and migrant workers?
Yeah, the pressure on understanding the social aspect of things is definitely there. And to Cheryl's point around data before, there is even more difficulties in collecting data for measuring the social impact. So we start seeing a number of initiatives around the social aspect of things, and how do we actually make sure that that is not only about the labor rights and human rights, but it's also about the impact that you as a company do have on the community that you're operating in. So we start seeing interest in internalizing the externalities from a social impact perspective, which is a very interesting way of saying, as a company, being Wilmar, you will be able to claim that the social impact that your operation do have a value that is beyond, you know, adhering to human rights. It's more than that, right? So I see definitely that the social aspect is in trend. Data is a challenge, but there are a number of initiatives in really making sure that you can start measuring that social impact. And one of them is really by internalizing the externalities. So you start giving them a monetary value.
Perpetua, would you like to respond to the social aspect?
Yeah, and I guess, so the addressing, and again, trying to be specific, like on the palm sector, right? And even forestry sector, I think the labor issues are not new. So they have been, I think, in discussion from, you know, I would say late 90s, early 2000s even, around some of these elements. But what is new is the kind of, I suppose, the proliferation of it in the public domain, talking about it in that sense. And I guess the sort of delay factor is probably due to the fact that you do need more specialized information as opposed to deforestation. Deforestation, anybody can go on sort of Google satellite or whatever, and anybody can start identifying where potential deforestation is happening. You can't do that with the social elements, right? And so I think what is new is really what it is in the public domain. But the addressing of these things, I think, again, if you look at the palm sector now, yes, it's sort of coming up as being said as, oh, these are things that have only just been identified, but well, they're not. Some of these risks are, they're linked to migration, labor migration, which is now becoming a problem because people can't travel with COVID. And so there are different ways of addressing that. But, I think the view very much is when you look at the various, sort of modern slavery acts that are put in place, I think, in the UK, the one in Australia, the ones in the US, they're also driving, and this is a personal opinion, they're also driving perhaps a kind of market protectionism that perhaps is there for certain crops, right? So I think in a way, if you look at the FGV case, I think it's fair to say that the petitions were submitted to the CBP, almost 2 years already. So it's not that it was something that came out of the blue, right? But perhaps one could perhaps talk about the timing of the sort of decision being made by the CBP. I don't know, I'm speculating, but it is, some of the things that you kind of look at. But, overall, I think, how do you talk about social issues? And I think part of the problem is it's not easy to equate that with the kind of dollar value. It's very difficult. Like, what does it mean? Like, you can talk about savings, you can talk about how much you've spent, but what does that actually equal to in terms of overall performance? So it is going to be a challenge. So having guys on the ground, I guess, and sort of a little bit more of a depth of knowledge around the human rights issues, I think is really what is needed in order to, if we want to start to improve really what the kind of reporting means with regards to implementation.
Yeah, I think KPMG in Australia, certainly on the back of the Australian law, has decided to develop a practice around the human rights as part of the ESG.
Correct.
Am I correct? Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. So we're at the end of time, and I've always been warned that, one of the things about webinars, you can't see the audience falling asleep, though they may actually have switched off their camera and fallen asleep. So we should keep to the time. Just in closing, if I could offer you a chance to make some general comments at the end, and then add my own. There are two comments, one question and one comment from my old friend Jean-Luc Anglada and another gentleman called Piers Gillespie, a bit broader. Piers has come from different sector, mining, and then moved to palm. Sorry, the other way around, palm to mining. And he sort of gets some sense, he felt that palm and forestry as a whole, resource sector as a whole, has got very high experience and standard. And secondly, especially large companies like Wilmar. Then Jean-Luc Anglada, I think in a way is commiserating with that idea that too many rating agencies have given too many guidances and structures, and whether others could sort it out like KPMG. So you can see them on the notes and question and answer. Would you like to respond to them and close off on any last thoughts you have? Shall I reverse the order and go to Perpetua first? Perpetua?
Yeah, and I think more around the comment about, maybe sort of palm sector being much more knowledge-based. I agree. And that's partly because there's always been pressure from day one, right? And so what you build up is, in fact, a whole sub-industry of sustainability expertise within the sector. And I've always said this to anyone that's sort of joining sustainability. If you want to be where the heat is heavy and where sustainability is at the cutting edge, it's the palm sector, right? So in a way, the message is, for the guys in the rating agencies, if you guys really want to start focusing on what reporting actually means in terms of implementation, you maybe need to look at where the sustainability implementers are at the highest level, and that right now is the sector. And but just don't touch my team. That's what I will say.
When you retire, Perpetua, you can go and work for one of them. Corrado, yeah. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, on Jean-Luc's question, and I can round off with that. I think the difference that we are seeing from the financial statement and the financial ratings and the ESG ratings is actually back to the concept we discussed around data, verifiable data and audited data. On the financial, so the day ESG data can be verified more accurately, and I'm sure there will be one day that ESG data will have to be audited in the same way as financial data. Then we will have an independent ESG rating that will be widely accepted. And that is then my concluding remark. I started saying 3 words from the title, Embracing Rising and Uncertain, I think this is the way of embracing ESG, is that most of the things that we will be doing in an uncertain and rising expectations world is really to look at the verifiability of data. And that is probably going to be the next big trend for someone like KPMG and auditor firm.
Thank you both. As I mentioned at the start, Meishi mentioned at the start, the SIIA works on sustainability, and in particular has got a new report coming out on the ESG, looking at some of the major companies. And we're not a ratings agency, we're not a green finance investor. Why are we doing this? It's partly to look at the implementation issues that Perpetua mentioned, to use that as a lens to see ESG as a lens on the implementation. How accurate a lens is it? And then of course, it's a way to observe, as Perpetua said, the broader trend sustainability. I think resource companies in our region, the big ones, have really been, as Perpetua shared with us, early, the canary in the coal mine. They want to feel the pressure early on and respond quite positively. The Wilmar of today isn't the Wilmar of 10 years ago. Far big changes I've seen, not just for Wilmar, but many of the large resource companies in our region have responded positively. There are gaps. One of them is the gap that Perpetua mentioned, how the national companies, the middle-sized companies, haven't really been under the same pressure and haven't really responded, haven't seen the incentives nor the pressure. And instead of the incentives, the remaining gap is still, while we're starting to see that green finance incentives, it's not really very strong at this moment. And as Corrado has mentioned, it's not really so verified or systematized that it's really so easy to use like financial data. So I think that this issue is a very live one. And I think we really had the benefit of two experts, one on the advisory side, one in the heart of one of the major companies in the region looking at this issue. I'd like to thank them both and thank you all for joining us